I was just going to say there's something deliciously ironic about Kahneman and Tversky misinterpreting the results of this experiment, given that, like ideally writing a book should involve system 2 thinking, you'd expect. And so you'd expect their critical faculties to come into play when they're interpreting the results.
So to be fair,
Okay, so we're delighted to have Hugo Mercier on the podcast, a cognitive scientist and the research director, I believe, at the CNRS in Paris. Our audience will be somewhat familiar with you already because you've written 2 books, first of which, The Enigma of Reason, co-written with Dan Sperber, I guess I should mention. We covered in episode 39 in fairly decent detail. And then the second book, Not Born Yesterday, we covered in our previous episode 84. And I think for the purposes of this conversation, because we don't have tons of time, we're actually just going to assume that the audience has listened to that episode. So the groundwork is somewhat laid. And with you, we can just focus on the juicy details and dive into all the questions we have. So yeah, audience, if you haven't heard that episode, maybe just pause this, go listen to that so that nothing comes out of absolute thin air. So to just kick it off and dive right into it, obviously a big trend in behavioral economics, social psychology over the past 10 to 15 years has been the focus on cognitive biases. If you go to the Wikipedia page on cognitive biases, there's 249 listed cognitive biases or whatever. And, it seems like people are just very focused on enumerating these and then, litigating in all the ways humans are irrational for this very reason. So, your work does discuss cognitive bias in some circumstances, but I'm just curious where you see yourself fitting in with that literature and if you have criticisms of that literature and the way people are sort of conducting that sort of research.
Yes, so first of all, thanks you guys for having me and for having discussed the books previously. That's great. It's a pleasure to be here. So it's funny when you've been doing that for a while. In fact, there are kind of biases, kind of meta biases in terms of what people are interested in. And when it comes to human adults, we are more naturally interested in errors and mistakes and failures. Things that make people look stupid. And it's quite specific because if you look at the literature, for instance, in developmental psychology, it's all about how incredibly clever babies are. A lot of the literature in kind of animal behavior is also look at, all the amazing things that, apes or dogs or whatever other animal can do. Because we have lower expectations, we're more surprised when it turns out that they can do things that are kind of impressive. Whereas human adults, probably the most, kind of smart thing that there exists that we know about, we tend to be more surprised when they make mistakes. And so that's naturally the literature is going to be focusing on these mistakes, even though if you go back to the original kind of Kahneman and Tversky formulation of the kind of the heuristics and biases program, which kind of launched this whole thing to some extent, their point from the beginning was that people have kind of smart heuristics, so they have these smart shortcuts that they use to be able to make sense of the world and to draw inferences. And as a byproduct of these heuristics, you have biases because the heuristics, by definition, they're not perfect. And so sometimes they will, the shortcuts will lead to some mistakes. And so in a way, every one of these biases should reflect the functioning of a heuristic that on the whole makes sense. So a way of seeing these biases is also thinking, well, actually, look, it just shows that the mind is made of many, many different mechanisms, and each of them functions in its own different way, and each of them will produce a specific type of mistake that reflects the fact that, on the whole, in a clever manner, it takes these shortcuts.
Yeah, so just building off that theme, I believe it was in Enigma of Reason, you had some criticisms of not only Daniel Kahneman's work, but...
these dual process theories. Dual process theories. If you could talk about that a little bit, I think our audience would be quite interested to hear just how your work and your theory of the mind contrasts and is different from Daniel Kahneman and dual process theories. Yes, no, that's a great question. So just for the listeners who are not completely familiar with this, dual process theories are a very popular, although I guess it's kind of waning a little bit, but they have been for the past 10 or 15 years a very popular set of theories in cognitive and social psychology and judgment and decision making, according to which the mind is mostly composed of system 1 mechanisms, kind of intuitions, so things are fast, relatively effortless, mostly unconscious. And on the other hand, you have these system 2 mechanisms that, we could call kind of reasoning, and that are supposed to be kind of slower, when you take your time and you think really hard and you weigh the pros and cons. And there are two, I think, issues. There's several issues with that view. The main one maybe is that very quickly system 2 becomes a kind of homunculus. So instead of being just another mechanism, the point of cognitive psychology is to decompose the mind so you can understand each mechanism as being a silly little box that does a simple cognitive operation so that you can hope to understand the whole thing. But then the system 2 just becomes us. It becomes the thing that directs everything else, that pulls the strings. And so you just push the problem of explaining how we make decisions away by saying, look, it's the system 2. Well, no, system 2 is also it has to be composed of stupid mechanisms that function intuitively because that's just how things work. So it's just a way of, putting the problem away. So conceptually, I think that's the main problem with this view. And then there are two other issues. One is, empirically, it's not clear that there are really mechanisms that are purely system 2 versus mechanisms that are purely system 1. So for instance, reasoning, as we were saying, usually is seen as a system 2 mechanism. And yet when we, for instance, at some point, we may be trading arguments, and we'll be doing that quickly, effortlessly. It will seem like completely natural, even though we'll be exchanging reasons. So typically something that should be system 2. And by contrast, imagine you're waiting for someone, at the train station, you're seeing the whole train being emptied, and you have to look for someone in the crowd. You're going to use face recognition mechanism. So the most kind of system 1 mechanism you can imagine, but it's going to be effortful. You'll have to sustain your attention. It will look like system 2 because, you're using this face recognition in a way that is somewhat unnatural. So the distinction there, it's not as if there are some mechanisms that are always system 1 and other mechanisms that are always system 2. And the last problem, which is the one that we discuss the most in our work, is that in most conceptions of this kind of dual process theories, the function of this system 2 is to correct system 1. So system 1 is the heuristics and the biases that we talked about earlier. System 1 relies on heuristics that make systematic mistakes, and system 2 should be kind of checking the output of these mechanisms to catch ourselves when we make a mistake. And that's kind of a priori implausible in the sense that it would suggest that you have, again, this kind of homunculus that is able to fix everything else. It knows the solution to all the other things. So if your mind was able to do that, well, you would have better system 1 mechanisms. It would be weird to have a system 2 mechanism that can fix all the system 1 mechanisms. It's also contrary to the data in the sense that people have made a lot of problems, little kind of reasoning problems like the bat and ball, in which you're probably familiar with it, but just in case, so a bat and a ball cost $1.10 together. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And everybody tends to save 10 cents, but in fact the correct answer is 5 cents. And you can see that, so you have system 1 that gives you the 10 cents, and so that's mistaken, and then system 2 takes over and gives you the 5 cents. The first problem with this is that most people don't get it. Most people get stuck on the 10 cents. So system 2 is just failing. And my colleague Wim Denis and his colleagues have also shown that actually the few people who get it right pretty much immediately. Mm-hmm. So the people who go through the wrong answer and then fix it, essentially it's 1% of the population. It's it's very, very rare. So empirically, this idea of system 2 fixing system 1 is just not what we observe. Mm. And that's why we have this whole theory for why system 2 has this other function that we discussed in the book that you've talked about previously.
So just so I understand the issue here. So the Kahneman and Tversky theory would predict that most people, if not everyone, would get the wrong answer for the bat and the ball thought experiment immediately. And then if you give them more time to think about it, system 2 would kick in and they would get it correct. But it seems like empirically what we witness is that either people just get it correct immediately, or if you just let them reason about it alone, they'll continually get the wrong answer and they'll just convince themselves that they're wrong. Yeah,
exactly. And you can give people a lot of time. You can pay people to get it right. You can use various things. Nothing really works.
So your theory, on the other hand, would predict that if you put them in a group and then you let them discuss the answer, then the right answer would probably emerge more often than not.
Yes, exactly. It was just.
And do you know if empirically, is that what we see?
No, that does work really well. Just to go back to the last point quickly. Actually, we've done one. So in one experiment we did, we wanted to make people more confident in the wrong answer. And we did in the bat and ball problem or other similar problems. And we did that by asking them to think about it harder. And so when people thought about it harder, like, maybe 2-3% of people figured it out, but most people actually became more convinced that the wrong answer was correct. That's because people have this kind of my side bias, so they're going to keep thinking of reasons why the wrong answer is correct, and they're going to be increasingly persuaded that it is the case. And so that's what happens when people reason in groups. And actually, we know that because we did this big experiment that will also answer the question you just asked, in which we had like large groups of people, like several dozens, maybe up to 200 people in a room, and we gave them the bat and ball problem, and they had to solve it first on their own, to try to solve it on their own, and then after about 5 minutes, they would be able to talk to their neighbors. And what we did is that every minute we measured what they thought the correct answer was and how confident they were in the correct answer. And so and then when you kind of graph the results, in the first 5 minutes when people are reasoning on their own, you mostly see, then again, a few people figure it out. It's very rare, but it happens. But mostly you see people becoming increasingly confident in the wrong answer. And then when they start discussing with their neighbors, you see the correct answer spreading like wildfire, such that after a few minutes, pretty much everybody gets it right. And it's not that people, kind of reinvent it. It's just that, they talk to the other people who got it right, and these people convince them. And what's nice is that because few people get it right on their own, you start with like a few, like if you color the people who get it right green, you start with a few green points and you see the green spreading, which means that the people who got it wrong, it's not like conformity, because conformity would lead to everybody getting it wrong because there's an overwhelming majority of people who started getting it wrong. It's not a matter of confidence because the people who got it wrong are really sure that the wrong answer is correct. It's just that the people who got it right have better arguments and they're able to convince the others. And then the people who have changed their minds are able to convince others in turn, which then again means that they have really understood why the correct answer was correct. So it's really just, this is a context in which argumentation works like nearly flawlessly. Like everybody essentially gets it right at the end.
I was just going to say there's something deliciously ironic about Kahneman and Tversky misinterpreting the results of this experiment, given that, like ideally writing a book should involve system 2 thinking, you'd expect. And so you'd expect their critical faculties to come into play when they're interpreting the results.
So to be fair, so Tversky, unfortunately, Tversky was dead by the time the dual process theory thing started. So we can't really, it's more of a Kahneman thing. And then again, it's not just Kahneman, it's something that was already existing in the literature that he popularized through his book and through his Nobel Prize lectures, and he endorsed, and I think he was kind of mistaken. But there's obviously some irony there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really interested to go back to the study. I believe in Enigma of Reason, you use the thought experiment of Alice is looking at Bob, who's looking at Carol, and same kind of logical puzzle in the sense that everyone intuits that the answer is this, but the answer actually is that. And when explained, everyone goes from being confused to snapping into place, and then you can see kind of the green dots spreading. So now, same experiment, except instead of that logic puzzle, you ask some question related to Trump and tariffs. I imagine that the argumentation is not going to spread and be as clean as in the logic puzzle. So I'm curious what you think the difference is between a question and a debate that has maybe a simple, clean, logical answer, and the more messy real world, and what you would expect to see in that latter circumstance.
No, that's a great question. So we have actually experiments in which we have questions that are not political, but they are not something that you can demonstrate logically. So for instance, we had like a very similar setup to what I described earlier, except that one of the questions was, for instance, how many elevators are there in the Empire State Building? There was another one about how many goals have been scored in a given football, like a soccer World Cup. And people's performance improves quite a bit as well. Like it doesn't converge on the exact right answer, which would be kind of weird. I mean, we're asking people not to just check online, obviously, but it does improve in the sense that some people are completely clueless, they don't follow soccer at all. They have no idea how World Cup works or something, so they're just gonna generate a random number. Whereas people who really know about soccer will have a good sense of exactly how many matches are played, how many goals are scored on a typical match, and so they do a bit of math and they can get a pretty decent approximation. And these people will be more convincing than the others. So it takes more time and it works less well, But for questions that are kind of factual, they're not logical, but they're factual, but you see like really kind of significant, very significant improvements in performance. And then when it comes to questions that are not only factual, but that are, for which people have kind of strong political opinions, it's going to get a little worse again. Because a minority of the population, not most, but a minority of the population will be kind of, just stuck in their views, and they will see any concession as just them, kind of essentially conceding that they're wrong about politics. And we know that in part because with some Japanese colleagues that we just ran an experiment in which, in a way, it's a bit similar. People are transmitting information to each other, but in that experiment, there's no arguments. You only transmit the estimate, the number that you're guessing. And we ask people to make guesses for either completely neutral questions, like, what is the distance between the sun and Neptune or whatever, and political questions such as what is the share of migrants in your country, or what is the share of, gay marriages or something. And what we observe is that broadly, most people react very similarly to both topics. So they take the advice into account to some extent, maybe not as much as they should, but, the thing that you observe in every kind of situation. But for the political questions, there's a small subsample of the population who is extremely confident in their answers, who tends to be quite inaccurate and who doesn't really change their minds. And they mess up so as a result of that, and these people only exist for the political questions and not for the neutral questions, because no one has a very strong opinion about the distance between the sun and Neptune. I mean, except, astronomers, I guess, but we didn't have any probably. And these people are going to lower the overall average because they're going to slow down the diffusion of the more correct information. So on the whole, I mean, you see these differences in the aggregate because of a small number of people. But for most people, this, it still works.
And do you have a sense of, is this just like a personality characteristic of some people, that they're just like wedded to certain views a priori and they're not going to change their minds no matter what? Or is this like just something that comes in the political sphere?
That's a good question. So I don't know exactly. Clearly, there's going to be differences based on the main source of the variance will be the content, in the sense that someone who might be completely impossible to change their mind on one topic, on another topic they might be very flexible, because the same person who cares a lot about Trump is not going to care about Neptune. So it's not just personality. Then there is going to be maybe some personality that some people, on the whole, will be more kind of reluctant to change their minds than others, maybe. And then there's going to be some interaction, such that some people, for some topics, are going to be very, very reluctant to change. And usually it has to do with their kind of their status in their social network, and how much their identity is invested with having such and such views. So if everybody knows that you're a big Trump supporter or a big Biden supporter or whoever else, and that it's part of your identity and it's part of how others see you, and then it becomes a bit of a problem if all of a sudden you start having views that seem to be kind of at odds with this, and people are, they'll think that you're maybe less reliable and this sort of things.
Okay, yeah, interesting. So this actually gets us a bit closer to a disagreement I think Vaden and I had in the previous episode over your thesis. So you talk about how evolution has bequeathed us a number of these sort of open vigilance mechanisms, which we use to filter and process information. Open because we want to be open, of course, sometimes to good arguments and new information because it's useful. Vigilant because we'd be taken advantage of if we weren't vigilant enough when it comes to new information. And this is where you're pushing back against gullibility. So, we have plausibility checking and whether information aligns with our prior beliefs, where it comes from, if the incentives of the teller align with our own incentives, etc. So we're wondering, I guess, to summarize the disagreement, if these are all sort of on the same level of importance, or do some of them take precedence over other ones? I think I lean closer to the view that, like, many of our views are socially informed. And like you just mentioned that when it comes to like political identity and stuff, I view that as like a very big predictor of people's opinions on a variety of subjects. Where I think Vaden views it as like just one of many things. So I'm just curious where you land.
No, that's a great question, and empirically we don't really know for a fact which it is, but clearly there's going to be a lot of variance based on the content. There are some contents for which it's mostly kind of our own experience that matters because it's a very kind of local belief. Like, my belief about what I had for breakfast this morning is not going to be influenced by anything else but kind of my own experience. And for other beliefs, like, when it comes to, what Trump did yesterday, obviously I have to rely on the news. I mean, it's pure testimony because I, right. I can't see Trump myself. So it's just gonna vary a lot based on the domain. So I don't think there's a general answer to that question. When it comes to purely kind of open vigilance mechanisms, arguably this plausibility checking that you mentioned, when you check whether communicated information is coherent with what you believed previously, is likely the most important, in that it's always there, like it's always on. Every time you hear or you read something, you can't help it. Like understanding something means checking it against the semantic information you have in your mind. So maybe that one maybe is a bit more important than the others, but in many contexts, we trust others enough that even if what they're saying clashes with what we believe, we're just going to change our mind routinely. And so, testimony plays a very important role as well. So it varies a lot.
Yeah, I see. I think I also wanted to say something like, well, plausibility checking in some sense seems socially reinforced, because what seems plausible to you right now is probably a function of your prior beliefs, which in turn is a function of your social community and whatnot. So I think I want to view it all as some sort of like being wrapped in some sort of social status signaling type game.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. But I mean, obviously all the beliefs that circulate have gone through the plausibility checking filters of many, many, many people. Sure. And so in the aggregate, you end up with things that most people, at least in the relevant community, will find kind of plausible. I mean, there are exceptions to this. I mean, there are beliefs that whose whole point maybe is to be implausible, but they're very much the exception. So I would still say that there's some degree, obviously, there's a lot of variability, and there's a little bit of arbitrariness. But if we consider the space of all possible beliefs that people could have, the subset of beliefs that are common is a very, very, very small subset that is very, very heavily influenced by the intuitions we have about what tends to make sense, what seems plausible.
Yeah, so just to move a bit closer to Trump and politics and stuff. So I've discussed your book with a number of friends now, because it's great because it pushed back against my intuitions, and then I love pushing back on my friends' intuitions. And they often will bring up Trump as a counterexample to the thesis that, on average, humans aren't actually all that gullible. And so you address this quite nicely in your book. The book was written after Trump's first term. But if I could steel man kind of the other side, or what an opponent might say, they might say something like, it's hard to believe the thesis that people aren't actually that gullible when they've just voted for someone who, for example, has told them that he would lower grocery prices and then imposed tariffs instead. And obviously one can pick from a number of examples of Trump saying he's going to do A and then doing B. So doesn't the fact that he was elected a second time indicate just how credulous and gullible the average voter of the public actually is? So how would you address a critic who says something to that effect? Yep.
No, I mean that is indeed a very good question. I think unfortunately Trump manages to capture a lot of things that people want. He does manage to have this image of being a strong leader, and to some extent he's doing that in a way that makes sense from the point of view of kind of honest signaling. So, for instance, when he's being a jerk, when he's insulting other candidates, all the behavior that we typically see as being terrible. In a way, he is signaling to his base that he's different from the other politicians, that he wants to be, that he's going to be someone who won't kind of bend the knee to the rest of the establishment. And indeed, I mean, now you have a lot of the Republican Party just sheepishly following him. So these were mostly true signals of his intentions, of how he would behave relative to the political system as a whole, and the fact that indeed he's a complete outsider in many ways, and he seems to obviously have no concern at all for any of the institutions. So these were things that he was in a way campaigning on, and that are actually true. So it's not as if it was completely like people to some extent got what they voted for. They didn't. Most people didn't vote for. You don't vote for specific policies. I mean, you vote for the whole package, and mostly you vote for one package. Instead of another package. So if you had asked, people before the election, do you want to impose a lot of tariffs on the rest of the world? I'm not sure they would have agreed. And indeed, it seems to be a personal kind of thing that Trump has with tariffs that is like an idiosyncrasy rather than something that makes any sense. So on the whole, I mean, I think to some extent the very things that he does that we find the most infuriating are the things that make him successful. It's also kind of interesting. Like my colleague Pascal Boyer is going to have a book coming out on politics shortly, and one of the points that he makes is that to a large extent, Trump's appeal is that he presents himself as being a strong leader, and when his opponents portray him as someone who is being very dangerous, to some extent they're reinforcing that. As someone who is, to be dangerous, you kind of have to be powerful. Like if he is powerless, then you couldn't be dangerous by definition, really. So a lot of the rhetoric of attacking Trump as someone who is indeed actually, I believe, very dangerous, also plays into his hand because it reinforces this impression that people have that he's someone who is going to be very strong. So, there is that going on, and another argument is that if it was that easy for him to convince people of what he was doing, he wouldn't be widely unpopular. and it's like he's the most. I don't know if he's yet the most unpopular president, on record, or he will likely be in a couple of months. There's a massive kind of thermostatic swing of opinions against him. So people are more pro. Like the American public, they're more free trade now than they have ever been, even though he's used his platform massively to argue in favor of tariffs. So people see, they see the reality, they see that prices are increasing, they see that everybody accepts him, and a few kind of Republican toadies think this is stupid. So it's not as if, it's not as if he could just persuade everybody to follow his views. Like on the contrary, there's a lot of pushback.
Okay, let's stay in the political realm for a second. So you have some great discussion in your book around propaganda campaigns throughout the 20th century. And you argue that in some sense they weren't that effective. They were effective at controlling behavior, but not actually in inculcating certain views into people. So most people under Nazi propaganda or USSR propaganda didn't actually believe what the state was saying, but they were, there was fear of reprisal. And so they sort of went along with it. And so I think your line is mostly that propaganda in some sense is actually not that effective at changing our minds. We're sort of wondering if those dynamics change in the new regime of propaganda, where now it seems less like top-down, single message, state-controlled style propaganda, and more just social media blasts, tons of essays written on various topics, possibly by bots, just Steve Bannon style propaganda, where you just put so much information out there that it overwhelms people, and maybe they stop paying attention to things. And so does this cause a problem for your thesis at all?
So there are two things. So the main thesis in the book is that, as you were explaining earlier, people have these mechanisms of open vigilance. That means that they're not gullible, they're not easily persuaded for bad reasons. And so in a way, the mechanism that you describe is kind of orthogonal to that. I mean, if you're just getting people to stop paying attention, is not persuading them of something. It's just, for instance, it's like if you have censorship, if censorship works, doesn't make people more gullible. It's just that you deprive them of information. And so indeed, I think the best example maybe of what you're describing is China. So China does that a lot. So whenever there's something, going bad in one part of the country, they're going to flood social media not with propaganda, but with news about celebrities or gossip or something else. So just to distract people's limited attention away from the things that they don't want them to pay attention to. And yet, to some extent, that seems to work because, we don't know. It hasn't been really empirically studied that well, but it just makes sense that if there is something that seems more interesting to you around, you'll pay attention to that. So it's not really. Then again, it doesn't go against the broader thesis that people are hard to persuade for bad reasons. But it doesn't mean that there are no ways of influencing public opinion in some way. But even in China, it's kind of hard. Like, people are pushing back, and other people are trying to, draw attention to the things that the government wants to hide. So it's never easy, but there are things that can be done. Yeah.
Yeah, it strikes me there's a major difference as well between, say, Soviet-style propaganda, where the goal is to get one message into the head of the populace, compared to what was just described about China, where the goal is to prevent the public from learning this thing or from hearing this message about this. So it's more just a distraction, and nothing in your thesis prevents, say, somebody with a bullhorn just making so much noise that the signals can't even be transmitted in the first place.
And then again, I mean, it's also, I mean, we cannot take for granted that people are going to be interested in the news, but most people are not interested in the news. And it's not, and political science models would typically predict that it's rational not to be interested in the news because it doesn't really have much of a practical impact on you to not be interested to be interested in the news. So it's not, I mean, it's already kind of a miracle that some people want to hear that there has been a strike on the other side of the country. I mean, why do you care? Right. Like, how does it impact your daily life? It's not clear. So it is indeed relatively easy to distract people, and it's not. I mean, it's easy, but first of all, I mean, most people are just not even paying attention in the first place. But actually, to go back to kind of to mix that with Trump, apparently there has been a poll recently, and one of the results was that the drop in popularity for Trump was the strongest among the people who are the least informed.
I've heard this
which
too.
is interesting because it seems as if. But these are also the people whose opinions are the easiest to change, because typically the least informed are the people who have the weakest priors, people who are not involved or interested in politics at all. So they're hard to reach because they don't really read the news, they don't really follow what's going on much. But once information does reach them, then it's going to be a bit easier to change their minds because they don't have they're not hardcore supporters of either party.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I was trying to think of other sort of counterexamples to your thesis to put pressure on it. And one that came to mind was actually advertisements. So it would seem to me that your thesis would predict that people are relatively immune from the effects of seeing, some Super Bowl ad. But at the same time, it seems like companies spend a huge amount of their budget on advertising, right? That's like, probably most of the money made on the internet is via advertising. And similarly with TV. And so are companies just being irrational when they pay so much for advertising, or like what's going on here?
Many people have argued that. There is a guy whose name eludes me, unfortunately, who wrote a book, I think, called the subprime attention crisis or something. And his point was that once people realize that on advertising, especially in that case online advertising, has such small effects, the whole internet is going to crumble because no one is going to be there to pay for Google or for Facebook or for all the other products. The best studies we have of TV advertising suggest that the elasticity of advertising, which means if you increase your advertising coverage by, let's say, by 100%, how much of that is going to be reflected in sales? So if you double your advertising budget and your sales double, your elasticity is 1. Like, you have like a perfect effect. And the average elasticity for TV ads is 1%. So on average, if you double your advertising budget, you'll increase sales by 1%. So it's absolutely tiny. And there's a lot of variance. So some TV ads will work better, but it's kind of hard to anticipate which. For online ads, it's more like 4% maybe, because it's easier to target a given population for whom the products will be relevant. So the effects are very, very small. And there's this great anecdote that Steve Levitt recounts in one of the kind of economics podcasts. So he's Chicago economist, and he was hired by a very, very large American company that sells tools to audit kind of their advertising branch. And so he comes in, and obviously no one has ever tried to measure any of the effect of the advertising. But they tell him, look, we know it works because. So then again, there's a company that sells tools. And they spend, millions and millions of dollars every year on advertising, selling tools. And the guy told him, according to him, I mean, I don't see why he would be lying. The guy from the advertising branch told him, look, every year before Father's Day and before Christmas, we place lots of ads and then people buy more tools.
Oh, no.
And he was able to find. So it was still back in the day when a lot of advertising goes through newspapers, and one day when in one town. One year, one intern had forgotten to place the ads. He had just fucked up and he was promptly fired. And so he was able to see whether there was fewer sales in that town on that year, and there was no effect at all. And then they stopped hiring him. So there's a lot of, in every company, there's a lot of kind of principal agent issues. And so the CEO wants the company to do well. But the CEO's priors, first of all, there's a question of, I think the priors people have about advertising are mistaken. So they might have a prior that it works. And because it's quite hard to measure the effect of advertising, they might just kind of go with the priors. To some extent, people have also suggested that there's kind of an ego thing. Like, if you're the CEO of a company and you see your products kind of plastered everywhere, or not the CEO, but, some higher up in a company or the marketing or advertising branch of a company, seeing your products plastered everywhere is probably kind of nice. And obviously, the people from the advertising branch are the ones who are the least likely who want to measure anything, because if people keep paying them to do their job, why would they ruin it? So it's possible that people aren't being stupid, but people have conflicting interests. Yeah.
There's a couple things I want to poke on a little bit. So I believe I've heard you make a distinction, but please correct me if I'm wrong, between advertising as, say, a small business to get awareness into the public that you exist. Advertising in that sense of just like, hey, I'm a little mom and pop shop, compared to, say, like Nike advertising yet another television show to people who already know about Nike but prefer Adidas, say. And so advertising in the sense of spreading awareness compared to advertising in the sense of trying to change the consumer's mind from product A to product B. So maybe say a little bit about that, and then I had another comment afterwards. But
completely. I mean, but that's my broad take on the literature. But I don't think there are experiments that have specifically tested this. But so there are experiments that have shown that essentially, whenever people have bought a product and they have the personal experience of a product, no amount of advertising is going to change that. So if you've bought a pair of shoes and you love them, then advertising for other shoes isn't going to really make you trade, because you have a product you like. And if you don't like it, no amount of advertising is going to make you decide that actually it was a good product. So personal experience is going to trump pretty much anything else. But it's also true that, I mean, advertising provides you with information, and if it gives you information about a product that you want, so if you're a big Star Wars fan and you see an ad showing, oh, there's a new Star Wars movie, well, maybe you're going to go see the Star Wars movie. And so it seems as if the advertising is working, but if the advertising wasn't there, it's quite likely that you would have heard about the Star Wars movie because it's a Star Wars movie, and you would have gone to see it anyway. So, for instance, when the largest study, or at least when I checked the literature a few years ago, the largest study of online advertising that had shown the effects I mentioned earlier of this elasticity of 4 or 5%, they also show that about half of that effect is customers that would have gone to the site anyway without the advertising. So it's pushing things forward in time. But without the ad, you would have heard, if it's a product that you're going to end up buying anyway, the odds are that you would have heard of it some other way because it's relevant to you, because your colleagues or your family or your friends would talk to you about it. So advertising can speed things up, and obviously that can be really important. Like if you have a product that people actually want, and so you want to spread the word about it, but other mechanisms can play a similar role, and these are the mechanisms like word of mouth. They tend to be slower but also more efficient, because obviously you're going to trust more your friend than an ad you see on the subway or something.
And I guess it struck me as well that, let's say advertising is 0.01% effective. Those who are studying it would conclude that advertising just doesn't work, rounding down to zero. However, if you have a customer base of 100 million people, and you put out an email marketing campaign and it's 0.01% effective, that's still enough to bring in potentially new customers, right? It strikes me that it could both be work at scale, but then also be found to be not effective in a studying environment. Yeah.
No, completely. You're completely right. So what these people want to measure is what they would call the return on investment. Like if you invest $100 in advertising, how much sales are going to increase? And it's possible that, given that a lot of advertising is very, very cheap, even a small elasticity might yield a positive return on investment. And so it might, even if obviously most ad prints are wasted. Like most people who see ads, they have zero effect on them. The few that are effective might be sufficient to justify the cost, in which case, as you are saying, on the one hand, people might be rational to advertise, and yet I'm right in the sense that people are still really hard to influence. And broadly, I mean, my take of the literature is that people advertise too much. And indeed, I mean, if you think of that, Google is likely the company that has obviously by far the most data on advertising, and they do advertise a bit, but it's not the company that you see the most everywhere in terms of advertising. So if they thought it was working as well, like extremely well, you would probably see more Google advertising. Actually, there was an early paper that had shown that that to measure the efficacy on the return of investment on online ads, given that the effects were so small and that they were so noisy, you needed millions and millions and millions of data points. And that was a paper by someone from Google, which was kind of funny. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they know that the effects are small for sure. Yeah.
You just need Google Premium. That's what they discovered.
yeah, exactly. Okay, I actually meant to ask this question at the beginning just because I'm curious about your answer here. So let me just pick on flat earthers for a second, and if there's any flat earthers in the audience, that they can change the example. But okay, so suppose you get a flat earther to actually bet anonymously on whether the Earth is round or flat. So suppose, ideal thought experiment incentives are set up such that you can, no one else in the flat Earth community especially knows how they're going to bet. So they're incentivized to be truth telling, however you do that. It seems like your comments on the Asch conformity experiment in the book would suggest that you predict that the flat earther would bet on the side of the Earth actually being round instead of flat.
I don't know. That's a good question. I think if as long as it's an explicit judgment, I think they might say that it's flat. If you think of the logistics of it, it's not clear because you'd have for the bet to be possible, people have to agree on a way of settling the bet.
Right.
And it's not clear how you would do that because if it was easy, if there was an easy way of settling the bet, they would already know the Earth is round, right? So I'm not saying that it's an interesting thought experiment, but in practice, I don't know how you'd actually do that. And I think a lot of how people would feel about how they would bet would hinge on how you actually verify the bet. And so if you can't really verify the bet, it's like, well, I might as well bet on what I believe because it's kind of, you can't really check anyway.
I feel like that question may need a little bit of back context for the listener because you're trying to control for the effect of social influence. And the question is, are people expressing views that they actually hold, or are they expressing views outwardly that maybe allows them to fit into a group? And so is that the correct context for your question, Ben? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was trying to, I guess, understand the relationship between your ideas and like preference falsification, for instance, where people express socially acceptable views, but often internally they believe something different explicitly. So if you get them in a scenario where they actually have like skin in the game in a situation, they'll, or you get them in a situation where you can actually expose like their true underlying belief, they'll sort of vote against what the group believes or their earlier professed belief. But then there would be, a different take on belief formation, which would be something like you actually internalize the group's professed beliefs. And I guess I'm trying to understand, where your thesis lands.
Well, I guess that's a great question, but it's very much like a case by case, thing that, like in the Asch experiment, you're put in a group at random of people you don't know who happen to be kind of confederate of the experimenter who says something blatantly false, and some people sometimes agree with them because just to be polite, essentially. But the difference with and indeed, as you're saying, if they're asked privately, they don't. They always pretty much always select the obviously right answer. But the difference with the flat earthers is that people are self-selected into flat earther communities. Like no one grows up essentially in a flat earther community. It's like you somehow you feel attracted to the community because for reasons that are not very, very clear, if I'm honest, but for a variety of reasons. So maybe like let's imagine if there was someone who has very very little kind of science background, who doesn't really know much about astronomy, and who ends up by chance in the middle of a flat earther community, of a flat earther conference, and everybody is big on flat Earth, everybody talks about that. Clearly, they have very strong opinions, and they ask him, what do you think the Earth is flat as well? And maybe they would say yes. But maybe if you ask them privately, they would say no. So that would be kind of the equivalent of the Asch experiment. But most of the people who are there because they chose to go there and to be with other people who believe the same thing. And so my intuition is that they actually, it's not preference falsification, it's not conscious preference falsification at any rate.
One thing I've noticed about your work is you're very descriptive, but you refrain from being prescriptive, or at least not too much. But I feel like the world could use a little bit of your prescriptions at the moment, as someone who's studied how minds do in fact change, and so what would you say to political analysts out there or people in very difficult conversations with friends, as has happened to me of late with regards to Trump and politics infusing into our personal lives much more than we would like? What recommendations do you have for people to have more successful kinds of conversations? Yeah.
Oh God, that's a good question. I think any advice I would have would come more with the fact that I'm not 20 anymore, rather than the fact that I've worked on that a lot. Just kind of be patient, kind of be kind.
Excellent answer.
Don't be an asshole. Don't just being right all the time is not necessarily the most important thing in the world.
Yeah, nice.
And at the end of the day, it depends on what you want. Obviously it's. Especially, I guess, when you're a young, male, it's more typically, it's a way of showing that you're smart, of showing that you're clever, and you want to prove a point, and you want to have good arguments, and you want to show that you're right, and I've been like this, and it's fine. It's also good to have people who are willing to question the status quo and to look. It's important to have good arguments. But it's also not the only thing that matters, and sometimes just kind of preserving social relationships also matters. And obviously, if you know someone who is in the Ku Klux Klan, it's fine to not be nice with them. But it's not as if always emphasizing being right just now is the most important thing, and trying to obviously. The problem is that oftentimes there's a trade-off in that. If you want to show how clever you are, you really want to nearly kind of humiliate your opponent and show like, look, your view is completely stupid, my view is completely right, I have such strong arguments. And to some extent, that's what's going to work the best to show that you're clever, maybe. But it's also the least likely to be convincing, because obviously people are going to get super defensive. And so if you want to be convincing, the ideal in a way, I'm saying that more based on kind of personal experience and observations rather than kind of hard data, but is to get the other person to kind of really believe that they've always thought that, or to make it, to make the transition smoother by actually, you kind of agree with me on this, so your view isn't completely different, and you make concessions, and so it's going to be, you're going to score less points in the sense of appearing very, very clever, but you're more likely to first of all, to have a constructive relationship in the long term with the person, and also to actually get them to change their minds.
Yeah, it would seem like your work aligns pretty well with the view that we're much more likely to change our minds based on someone's arguments who shares a lot of background information with us. And so the more overlap you have with someone, then if you just diverge on the last little bit, you can have a constructive conversation about it, knowing that you share so much background versus someone who's completely at the opposite end of the spectrum.
And most non-psychopathic people agree on most values. It's not as if we're all humans. We all value approximately the same things. Obviously, there's we still have very different beliefs, but for instance, there are some of the experiments I have in mind. In the experiments that have shown that even a short conversation with someone about trans rights. I think they had done that experiment on trans rights. So it's a canvasser would come to your house, and if you agreed, they would talk to you about trans people's rights for about 20 minutes, and it would be, so there would be a bit of kind of argumentation, but a lot of it would be, trying to get people to put themselves in the shoes of someone who is being kind of discriminated against, and this kind of discussion. And it had kind of this lasting impact on people's acceptance of trans rights. So, and that was just 20 minutes. So if you multiply these kind of discussions, you can see how it can have an impact. And actually, if we have just a couple of minutes, this is a funny experiment from a kind of sociology of science point of view, because someone had done exactly the same experiment about gay rights, and they had published the paper. It was published in Science, I believe, so big paper, a very splashy thing. And then it turns out that he had made up all the data, essentially. And so the people, and the two social scientists, sort of kind of political scientists, Brockman and Kalla, who had uncovered the guy had made up the data, actually did the actual experiment that the guy had faked, and it worked. And that's the experiment I just described. So there's kind of an irony there. So no, it works. Yeah, we know it works. Yeah, it's just it takes time and it takes some effort, because sometimes you're so incensed by someone else's view, and they themselves might want to just get in your face and also try to be kind of dominant and just to say, look, take things easy. Yeah.
Okay, speaking of faking data, now I feel compelled to ask you about your opinion on sort of the health of psychological sciences and empirical sciences, social sciences in general. So, I mean, obviously your work is characterized by taking an evolutionary lens on reasoning and whatnot. So there's like deep theory undergirding everything. But, you rely on experiments on, undergrads in psychology labs and orangutans sometimes, etc. And so I guess, has your work been affected at all by what is now known as the replication crisis? Are you pretty optimistic about where the field's going? Do you think the reform efforts underway are working?
Yes, clearly things are getting better. I think to some extent evolutionary psychology and cognitive psychology have been less affected, and I think there are studies that have looked at the replication rates of different disciplines or different journals that bear that out. Have been less affected than social psychology, partly because, and that goes back to the discussion we had at the very beginning, evolutionary psychologists and cognitive psychologists tends to be more interested in the things that the mind does well. And so it tends to be less flashy. It's like, look, people, they do these things kind of rationally and things kind of work out well. And these findings tend to be, then again, kind of less flashy, but as a result also kind of more reliable. I mean, they're less, they don't have to be super surprising to be interesting. And so they tend to be more reliable, whereas social psychology, which tended to stress a lot of, look, people are stupid in this specific way, like people are really easy to influence with primes or whatever. Right. That tends to replicate much less well. But on the whole, the field is clearly going in the right direction. There's an interesting discussion to have as to whether the changes we're seeing now are due to a proper reflection on how we should do things, or to the fact that now, for the past 10, 15 years, we've had access to a lot of participants through online platforms. And that has really completely changed experimental psychology, in the sense that now the vast majority, at least in some fields, the vast majority of studies are done online. And so it's much easier to get large samples. It's much easier to replicate experiments. Because in a way, the message that, there's p-hacking, there's file drawer problems, there's a replication crisis, people have been saying that since the 70s, and nothing had changed until it was actually easy for us to run large experiments that are well-powered, so that have a large sample size and that you can replicate. And it's also easier for us now, for instance, to do experiments in different countries. I'm just saying, so all of these changes are happening, and it's positive. I'm just not sure they're happening for the right reasons. But as long as they're happening, it's good.
Right. Yeah. Nice. Okay. Well, we're closing in on the hour, and so we should let you run.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. It was great. No, great questions. I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.